In this video, we're going to investigate one of the issues arising on the AQA syllabus, and that is, which is more important, the ending of pain and suffering or the increase of pleasure? We're going to look at four thinkers here. That's Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Karl Popper and Ninian Smart. Now remember, in the exam you're only going to have about 12.5 minutes to answer this question. So the evaluation that I give here might take a little bit of time, but we need to make sure that we can give a simplified, streamlined version in the exam. So let's begin with Jeremy Bentham. Now he argues that neither pleasure or pain should be given any special weight or consideration. The important thing is the total amount of pleasure that would come out of any given action. So we shouldn't try and avoid causing pain, and we shouldn't really prioritise pleasure over anything else. It's simply the sum total at the end. What does it add up favouring? If there's a total amount of pleasure at the end, then do the action. If there's more pain, then don't do the action. And he gives us his philosophic or hedonistic or hedonic calculus in order to do this. And it's simply a moral mathematical equation for him. We can see that in the Colosseum example, where Bentham acknowledges that someone might be in a tremendous amount of pain. If they were to be killed, that would be a very painful action. It would end their life. It's kind of the maximum amount of pain and suffering we can imagine. But the pleasure of the people watching would outweigh that. And we don't give any special consideration to the real intensity of one person's pain rather than the kind of mild pleasure of many, many, many people. So for Bentham, the net sum, the net value of pleasure is the important thing, not the avoidance of pain. So because he sees this symmetry between units of pain and units of pleasure, for him the most important thing is the net increase in pleasure and not the avoidance of pain. As we've seen, Mill's version of utilitarianism is quite different from Bentham's, but to answer this question, they actually end up in pretty much the same place, even though they take different routes. So for Mill, the important thing is that the greatest happiness wins out in the end. It is still moral mathematics, just like Bentham. But he thinks that it depends what type of pleasure is involved. For instance, he famously says that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. This suggests that some pleasures are worth having, even if they also come alongside discomfort and pain. This leads to some very different moral conclusions drawn by Mill rather than by Bentham. So if we look at the same example, according to Mill's version of utilitarianism, the Christian in the Colosseum would not be killed because the pleasure they experience from being alive outweighs the pleasure that all the other people experience from watching someone get killed. What's important to note here is that although Mill does stop the painful situation of an innocent Christian being torn apart by lions, he's not doing it because he values pain as being of more moral weight than pleasure. He's doing it because the pleasure of being alive is of more moral weight than the pleasure of watching someone die. So even though his response to this ethical dilemma is totally different from Bentham, Bentham allows the killing, Mill stops it, they're actually doing it for the same reason, which is that the total amount of pleasure determines which action you take. The next thing Mill would say is that he would introduce his rule utilitarianism, and he'd say that it depends on the rule that would subsequently be established in terms of whether or not we should prioritise pleasure or pain. But again, the greatest happiness wins out in the end. If we look at the Colosseum example, Mill would probably argue that killing someone because they belong to a minority group would be damaging for the majority as a whole. It would stop innovation, it would stop people expressing their opinions, which would create a kind of static society where new ideas couldn't be formed, industry wouldn't develop, concepts wouldn't develop, philosophy wouldn't develop, and that society would ossify, kind of die out. He would say, therefore, that the idea of killing minorities doesn't form a good rule. it doesn't form a rule that is of benefit to the greatest number of people. And so even though the majority might think killing minorities is good fun, in the long run, their well-being, the utility of society, is not served by such an action. So again, Mill is not stopping this senseless murder because he thinks that the pain is of special value. Rather, he's doing moral mathematics, and he thinks the rule, killing people in this situation or killing an innocent Christian, does not outweigh the benefits of preserving the rights of minorities. Now we come to our first objection to the idea that pleasure and pain are equal, or that there is a symmetry between the two, so 1 unit of pleasure equals 1 unit of pain. Karl Popper argues that this is fundamentally untrue, and therefore the basis of the hedonic calculus has been a mistake. He says that pain is of much more moral significance than pleasure. And it's quite easy to see his point. A mild physical pleasure that accompanied you throughout the day would make you a little bit happier, I suppose, but you'd probably get quite used to it relatively soon. However, a mild pain, let's say the early gnawing signs of toothache, that can really destroy your happiness and well-being for the rest of the day. A nice compliment on a dress you're wearing or a new pair of spectacles would probably make you feel a little bit better inside for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then you're over it. However, a cruel comment about your dress or your spectacles might stay with you for a good number of hours. Therefore, according to Popper, we should make sure that if we are to use a utilitarian system, we concern ourselves with eliminating pain and suffering and not bringing about more pleasure. Popper's system also said that more pleasure for the happy shouldn't count the same as more pain for the suffering. For instance, you might really want a brand new iPhone. However, some of the materials that are needed in order to create your iPhone are mined at great human cost. For instance, there is the material coltan, which amongst other places is mined in the Congo. And as you can see by the images on the screen, it's often mined by children who are under the threat of terrible mistreatment, and they are treated as if they have no human rights. The coltan mines in the Congo are also the cause of a terrible civil war that's led to rapes and murders, as you would imagine. Therefore, the extra pleasure that rich people in the West get by playing with their brand new iPhones should not be added up and seen as somehow morally equivalent to the terrible pain that these ruined communities feel in the Congo. Because people in the West already have a very high standard of living, their extra pleasure at getting an iPhone should not be considered to be of the same scale or scope as the extra pain that people who are already living in very difficult conditions and in very difficult circumstances feel by being part of the mining process. According to Bentham, if we added up all the individual moments of happiness and the increase in productivity and enjoyment that the millions and millions and millions of iPhone users have received because of the work in the coltan mines, and subtract it from the pain of the ravaged communities of coltan miners, we might end up saying that the price is worth paying for the poor coltan miners. Our happiness is worth their suffering. However, it's quite easy to see that using Popper's logic, we shouldn't be heaping pleasure onto people who've already got it, and instead we should prioritise the reduction of pain, in particular for those who are already experiencing a lot of it. Popper is writing at the end of the Second World War, and his final criticism of utilitarianism is born out of his experiences in that conflict. He says that all ethical theories should respect the rights of the individual, because theories that don't, and that aim to create a greater good and a utopia, always end up being evil and creating dystopias. You can see the example of the persecution of minorities in Nazi Germany, for instance. The Jewish people were systematically stripped of their human rights. And we could imagine that the majority of the population, the Germans, who were made to feel better by this arrangement, we could imagine that the net pleasure experienced outweighed the pain, simply because of the sheer numbers of people involved. And yet, to talk about justifying the Nuremberg laws, or even to attempt to justify the Holocaust, feels sickening and wrong. Popper would avoid this. His negative utilitarianism is all about reducing pain and suffering. That is the purpose, and that governments, laws and the legislature should work to avoid the suffering that people feel and not worry about trying to bring about happiness that people feel, because happiness is temporary and fleeting and should be something that individuals search for in their own way. But pain and suffering is absolutely devastating. Popper's criticisms are really useful for this issue's arising, and they're also quite damning for utilitarianism as a whole. However, Ninian Smart claimed that his theory, if taken to its logical extreme, would involve the painless execution of everyone on the planet. This mass euthanasia would ensure that no one felt any more suffering, because, according to Smart, Popper's system doesn't value pleasure at all, so the best solution is to kill everyone. Popper indeed recognised that this was a flaw, and he was merely floating his idea of negative utilitarianism as a way of exposing some of the major problems with utilitarianism. He wasn't, and nor, to my knowledge, has there ever been someone who actually believed that negative utilitarianism should be an enacted government policy, or a personal ethical code. So, we might well get a question like this in the exam. Ending pain should always be more important than increasing pleasure. To what extent would a utilitarian agree with this view? And I think that we'd have to start off by explaining that Bentham's all about increasing pleasure as a net result, and so he doesn't prioritise pain or pleasure. They're not worth anything special in his system, they're both worth the same amount. So we could end up by saying, I suppose, that Bentham is more in favour, really, of just increasing net pleasure. Mill is similar, although the modifications of his theory lead to him giving different solutions in ethical dilemmas to Bentham, but the basic principle is the same. We should do the action that brings about the most amount of pleasure. However, we've also got Karl Popper to consider. And Karl Popper, his view is that pain is far more significant than pleasure, and that pain should therefore have more moral significance, and that utilitarianism should be inverted and be called negative utilitarianism, and we should really focus on reducing pain and suffering for all the reasons given above. And then finally we've got Ninian Smart's criticism of Popper. Here we would have to conclude with our own personal viewpoint. Which do you think is most important, pain or pleasure? Here you can see a sample exam question that has appeared in the past, and also the mark scheme. Have a read of the mark scheme. It's not terribly thrilling, but it should give you some confidence about the sort of responses that the exam board are actually anticipating.